What is up with this book, man? Many things feel like they're in place, but then there are just like those kind of things where it's like, but wait, why would that be the case if this was canon? It feels like it's trying to answer questions, but only at a glance. The second you think about those answers and how they're presented, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so the very fast TLDR, because I know a lot of people haven't read this book yet. A young businessman who graduated college at 13 or whatever, he got degrees. And he's taking over the Fazbear brand to make it a profit and make it special, and he doesn't really care about anything else. He has a rivalry with Edwin, whose company was bought out by Fazbear Entertainment. Edwin is kind of the voice of reason and sanity in the story, is just a generally good person and believes in imagination and stories and having actual people do things rather than an automated storytelling tree with a tiger head in it, which is kind of the main focus of the book. Burroughs wants to make a goddamn giant baobab tree with a tiger inside it that makes all the AI-generated stories for the Pizzaplex to use. Edwin reasonably thinks that hooking up all of your animatronics that rely on stories, which are effectively all of the animatronics, period, into one machine is a dumb idea, and tries to get it to stop, and figures out that it's running a program called Mimic 1. Burroughs, not really aware of what's actually happening, decides to blame Edwin for every single problem that this stupid tree causes. So Burroughs creates this whole plan to successfully trap Edwin inside the tree and suffocate him to death, and then when he goes in to check on him later, because things aren't fixed yet, because he thinks Edwin's doing all the problems, he goes in there himself, gets trapped by his own program, and then suffocates to death. Also, before Edwin died, he wrote on a bunch of multicolored construction paper, and it's like a bunch of formulas and equations and shit. Before we get into all the stuff with the Mimic, let's talk about what people are immediately misunderstanding or looking into the wrong way, in my opinion, which is about the time period of this story. Edwin states his company was bought by Fazbear LLC 30 years ago. It doesn't specify LLC, but we can assume it considering that he's part of the Pizzaplex, and that is the LLC. The only date we've ever been given for security breach is 2035, 13 years after the presumed time period of FNaF 3 and Pizzeria Simulator. People try to argue that if Edwin's company was bought out in 2005, which would be 30 years in the past from 2035, he can't be bought out in that point in time because, hypothetically, Fazbear Entertainment wouldn't be open or would be a dormant brand at this point, since the location in Freddy's 1 closes in roughly the mid to late 90s. The next time a Freddy's would be open to be absorbed would be FNaF 6's Freddy's, which would be in roughly 2023. Adding 30 years to that point, where after that place burns down and then a new Fazbear's is born, then you would maybe get roughly the 2053 at the earliest to the 2060s, kind of towards the later edge. But this gets real weird when you consider Edwin's history further than that. Edwin is specifically stated to be 64 years old, and he mentions having vintage Freddy Fazbear's posters and signboards, and more importantly, witnessing something brutal, bloody, and hearing his own screams, and having general trauma related to the brand. If this story was directly canon to the games the way that GGY and Bobby Dot seem to be, going back to his 64 years of life, he wouldn't be around in the original era of the brand. In case you can't do math, if Edwin's 64 and we're in 2053, going 64 years back would be 1989. 2 years after FNaF 2, the last series of murders with publicly visible murders or bodies. And FNaF 1 doesn't have any noticeable murders that Edwin would have seen. Edwin wouldn't be old enough to be an employee to see kids or people being stuffed into animatronics. And Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place in FNaF 6 has no public murders or deaths. It's the burning. It's just one clean fire at the end. There is no massacre that happens there. So even if we are assuming that we're in the 2053-2060 range, by the same logic that the games have to be in 2053 to 2060 because there's this whole dead zone in the 2005 kind of time period range, then we also have a dead zone where he can't have witnessed anything traumatic. Meanwhile, if this is just something weird where the company did exist in that point in time, just not as an open location or whatever, just whatever Edwin's company was bought, maybe it was a goddamn virtual company, maybe they made video games and shows. Point is, Edwin's company could have been bought in multiple regards. We aren't told what Edwin did. So if he was, say, just a random tech company or place absorbed by Fazbear's, and we go 64 years back from 2035, he actually would have been a teenager right around the series of original murders, which does line up. Either Edwin can't have seen an original series of murders in the Canon games lore and events, or Edwin has to be absorbed in a point in time where no company exists. Or the more likely solution, the story isn't canon and this just applies to a different series' continuity. The StoryTeller tree itself isn't in security breach, And it's supposed to be this like big front and center main thing. There's also a repeated mention of a yellow roller coaster that, unless I'm forgetting something, doesn't really appear in Security Breach. I mean, maybe this is a writing error where someone just didn't fully understand what Monty's whole like rail system for shooting the different targets was. Because that is kind of a roller coaster, but the colors don't match. And while it's tempting, the construction paper to post-it room connection doesn't really work. The post-its are very childish and goofy and have binary, but that's not really the same as complicated equations, which is what was in Edwin's room. It might be a reference to the post-it room, but I don't think it's actually in continuity the same post-it room or idea. Speaking of which, the thing that really makes it hard to say this is canon, ironically, is another Tales book, GGY, which a lot of people do consider canon. I know there's some arguments you could make about the Pizzaplex being like 3 to so years old, even with StoryTeller, because you could just say that roughly 25 to 30 years after Edwin's company gets absorbed, they start making the Pizzaplex, and then we have the present day of StoryTeller and GGY and Security Breach and all that. The main problem is that we still have a missing tree that's never built, and would have to be built after Security Breach, because we don't see in Security Breach, and after Security Breach is Ruin. Which brings us to our main problem. We have to have StoryTeller occur after Ruin because we don't see its events in Security Breach. Because if StoryTeller was actually that important to the game's continuity, I feel like it wouldn't do this kind of stuff where, oh yeah, there's this giant yellow tree we never see. Unlike GGY, which once again felt like it was written to be a Security Breach prequel story. Because even though there are things we didn't see in the Pizzaplex, the yellow tree is supposed to be in the atrium close to Monty Golf. And we also know there's not an argument like, maybe this is another Pizzaplex around the same time, because this is the one related to the Mimic story built over the pizza place. And if that's the case, then there's not multiple pizza places to be built over. And if it's not the FNaF 6 pizza place, if it's a generic Freddy's place, then we're not connected to Security Breach at all, and we're telling our own story in the same universe in a different location. Because there is another option. It's just a different continuity's unique version of the pizza place or Pizzaplex or whatever. So all of the Tales books have epilogues kind of similar to the Stitch Race Stingers, where they all interconnect to this whole villain of the Mimic, which is a black rogue endoskeleton with bunny ears killing people. In very short, simple terms. Currently, Edwin's yet to be mentioned in the Mimic storyline. If I were to hazard a guess, the story we're building towards is that Edwin somehow crosses into the Mimic 1 storyline. He mentions he's very guilty and kind of considers himself being self-punished by having the vintage posters around, which implies he has some level of responsibility to these vintage posters and something that happened. I think where this story is building is that Edwin, in the epilogues, will do something that gets rid of or defeats the Mimic, but in doing so dooms all of the other characters we've been following in the epilogues. Or at least causes a lot of them to be dead, or has some level of responsibility for something bad happening. This is the bloody and horrific trauma he has, and this would also include why he has vintage posters at all. The buried pseudo FNaF 6 counterpart original Freddy's location that the Pizzaplex is digging up would be where he got this all from, because that's the setting of the Mimic storyline. This is extremely heavily implied by the reaction he has to Mimic 1 running on the Storyteller's AI. And Burroughs, being the ignorant, corner-cutting asshole that he is, digs up the Mimic and causes it to be loose again. Which is very similar to the whole glitch trap kind of storyline, but in a weird, different way. So a lot of people are treating the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues and storylines and a lot of the stories as canon inherently, especially if they have connections to Mimic, because Mimic is kind of a reference to the FNaF 6 pizza place. I mean, it is a Freddy's pizza place buried sort of under the Pizzaplex. I will give it that. It feels like it should be the FNaF 6 Pizzaplex. It would be very misleading if it wasn't. But at the same time, the stories have weird impossibilities that just don't line up correctly. Like, you're telling me, oh yeah, there's just this whole like roleplay area we didn't know about. You didn't know about the water attractions? You didn't know about the giant yellow tree? It's like how would that not be advertised or acknowledged or shown off in Security Breach if these were true direct tie-in stories to the events of Security Breach? Every story that gets added connecting to Mimic has another wrinkle we have to process and try and figure out how it works with. I mean, like, a lot of the other things I was like, okay, maybe they're just another Pizzaplex. I was giving so many stories the benefit of the doubt that maybe they became that way. But a giant yellow tree
in the atrium, a location we have access to in Security Breach that is supposed to be nearby Monty Golf, and that we just don't see, is just not there. And that is a one-to-one, outright stated, direct connection to Mimic. So at this point, I don't think we can say a story is canon just because it's connected to Mimic. I thought Mimic's storylines were canon, but now we're getting stuff that's like, nope, there's no way you can bullshit by saying this is another Pizzaplex, or this is just something that's not in the main game, or these are off-bounds locations we just don't have access to. There is no counterpoint to say, that tree is just something there somehow we didn't see. And the fact that GGY doesn't have, maybe it will, and maybe it just hasn't had yet, or maybe I just missed something, but it seemingly doesn't have any connections to the Mimic plotline, and is the most one-to-one. It has characters from Security Breach, it has all of the descriptions from Security Breach, it feels intertwined into the plot of Security Breach. Because even Bobby Dots has like, it's kind of its own story to a limited extent, where it's just like, oh, okay. It just all feels disingenuous to try and pretend Tales is really canon still. It might be. There is always a chance where you're just missing information that will be presented later that will make it make more sense. But as of right now, we are just shown things that are not there. And to assume how they would get there requires weird other assumptions like, oh, the Pizzaplex would be rebuilt after ruin, so that way the Storyteller tree could be built just for the Mimic 1 program to still be around, hence kind of undoing all of Security Breach's plot, because I'm presuming the goal of Security Breach and Ruin is to defeat Glitchtrap properly. And if he is the Mimic, if the Mimic is related to Glitchtrap, or Springtraps, or William, then that means no matter what we do in Ruin, we're going to lose. We are bound just to have Burrows dig up the Mimic and put it in the tiger in the Storyteller tree, and then it's just around and loose again by the end of Storyteller, making everything Gregory does borderline pointless. Because that's the biggest thing, because you could say, sure, after Ruin it is 100% going to be rebuilt. What the hell is the point of the games if he's just going to continue being around in the books? That is the biggest thing to me. It pretty much invalidates everything you do gameplay-wise to say Afton's running around as the Mimic in the short stories, because they like finishing their own plot lines in the short stories. Frights made that abundantly clear. They were going to set up a problem and solve it themselves in this own contained story. And it would make no sense to write all of these Mimic stories and then not have a conclusion to them. So we are just waiting for a conclusion that will, either the games will invalidate the books or the books will invalidate the games. And I don't see either happening unless they're in their own stories, where the Mimic is the Tales version of William running around doing stuff, or Tales version of Glitchtrap or Burntrap or whatever. And he will have his own conclusion and his own story arc, separate from the Security Breach version. That is how I expect and would see things happening. To me, that is what I think is going to happen. Anyways.
Burrows wants to make an AI.